It's in February of 1990 that a sightseeing helicopter there in New York crashed in the East River. Almost everyone on board survived, was rescued. One of those was father named Bernard Faller. His 13-year-old son, Robert, was on board the helicopter. Bernard survived, but Robert was trapped in his seatbelt. And despite the attempts of Bernard and the other passengers on board, they could not release him. And he stayed under the water for 20 minutes before being brought out to safety by the rescue divers. And he was officially pronounced dead in the few days that followed in the hospital. Now, I don't remember all those details, but I do, from when I was a child, I would have been 6, I do remember seeing this news story on the TV, watching it with my family, and I remember my dad's immediate response after seeing it. Just think of the details again. If you're a dad, especially a male, that you are in this scenario with seatbelts, your child is in his, you get out of yours, his won't come undone. What might you reach to be able to help him get out of his seatbelt? I remember my dad's words distinctly. He said, "Yet another reason why it's always good to have a pocket knife on you." I'm assuming that I remember that statement connected to this news story because it registered emotionally with me that my dad was thinking, how would I be able to rescue my son when he was trapped? That reflects just a truth about connection. Inherently, connection is risky. When we connect ourselves to anything, it could harm us. So even the very things that promise security and safety could also then be dangerous. Think of how quickly that happened for young Robert. The very thing that saved his life in the crash ended up being responsible for him drowning just a few minutes later. Jesus, Matthew chapter 28, invites everyone to come to him. He says, "Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me." Learn being the same root word for disciple. So take my yoke upon you. Learn from me. Why? Because he says, I'm gentle, I'm lowly in heart. He is humble in using his power. Therefore, he can say, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. He also promised, when you come to me, you'll find rest for your souls. So he's communicating that in a world where you'll find resistance, you'll find those who will mistreat you because of me. With me, you find true rest. Therefore, your connection must be to me. And he uses this word yoke to communicate that truth. Connect yourself to me, and I will guide you. So yokes were used in agriculture to connect animals, and they could do more work together than they could separate. You take two separate oxen, and they would do less work than two that are connected together. Beautiful concept. Well, Jesus is saying you must yoke yourself, connect yourself to me. Now, what's interesting about this truth, and that you're going to see in chapter 12, so he has the promise at the end of chapter 11, yoke yourself to me. Chapter 12 is going to show us what happens when we don't yoke ourselves to Jesus, and then also what does happen when we do. It's all based on this principle. Before we yoke ourselves to someone or something, we better understand where it eventually leads. Using that concept of the yoke, God would warn and talk about these things with the Israelites. Leviticus chapter number 26, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their slaves. I have broken the bars of your yoke and made you walk upright. You were yoked, enslaved in Egypt, and I've broken that yoke so that you could walk free. So there, as a people, they were yoked to enslavement in Egypt. Where was it leading? It was only leading to death. God says, I freed you from that yoke. Numbers chapter 19, interesting concept, because when they would offer an animal as a sacrifice, one of the purity clauses for how they were to give it, it's blameless, it's without spot. It has not been yoked to another animal before. Why is that? Because it would show the marks. It would bear marring features that it's been connected to another animal. See, when we yoke ourselves to someone or something, it's going to impact us directly. Jesus is saying, you yoke yourself to me and no one else, nothing else. Interestingly, even before they get to the promised land, the first wave of Israelites begin to struggle with the temptation for idolatry. So later in Numbers chapter 25, so Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. So not only do you have this tragedy that the Israelites have not even made it into the promised land and they're already tempted to step out and commit adultery against God with other gods, with Baal specifically, but Moses uses the word yoke to tell us they've connected themselves to him. They've connected themselves to a false god instead of remaining yoked to God and to God alone. So now that emphasizes this principle on the screen. We better understand where it will lead before we ever connect ourselves or yoke ourselves to it. So what Jesus is going to do in this section, and what Matthew's doing in depicting Jesus here, is to show us that there were plenty of Jews, Jewish leaders, who would have said, here's how you get rest. The very thing that they were yoking themselves to was actually increasing their enslavement instead of providing true rest. And so Jesus uses this moment to address a very real problem that was in their hearts. Matthew chapter 12, let's begin reading verse number 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. He said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. So here you see introduced this word for the first time in Matthew, Sabbath. Of all the interactions Jesus is known for having with the Pharisees about the Sabbath day, interestingly, this is the first time Matthew's brought it up, and it will essentially be the only time Matthew brings up this skirmish over the Sabbath day. You see two more references to it in the rest of the gospel, but they're not about this disagreement. So Matthew wants us to see clearly that when the Jews escalate their opposition to Jesus, one of the touch points, the initial touch points, was the Sabbath. What's the Sabbath? It's that prescribed weekly, quote, off day, as the Jews saw it, which they were to work 6 days and not work the seventh. So if we're going to summarize this interaction that Jesus has with the Pharisees, we could say it this way, that despite their noble intentions, the Pharisees' expertise on the Sabbath still had not led them to understand God's will. They made a big deal about the Sabbath. Here's how that happened. In the time leading up to their captivity, so you look at the prophet like Ezekiel, and even a statement or two from Amos, part of their warnings about how they had become unfaithful was you're not honoring the Sabbath day. You're squeezing in things that you think are not technically work, but they'll help you out, and so you're just using it still for your advantage instead of taking it off and honoring God. You're still treating it like every other day while saying, I'm keeping the Sabbath. You're finding all sorts of loopholes to profane the Sabbath. Well, they heard that warning over and over again, and they didn't heed it. They didn't heed the other warnings that they were making pre-captivity. So they go off for 70 years to Babylon, who was ruthless, full of pagan idolatry and all sorts of wickedness. And they remember, wait a minute, we're supposed to be honoring God weekly with the Sabbath. They realize, hey, if we can keep this ritual every week, that'll ground us in God. So they get serious about a lot of things, including the Sabbath day. And they remember that it says you're not supposed to work. Well, they go back and they flip through the scriptures the best they can. They try to remember, And then they think, well, did God really ever clearly define what work means? If he says you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, what counts as work? What doesn't count as work? And so out of a noble place, their time in captivity, came this obsession with this question, what is work? And it developed into a series of 39 different categories and just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stipulations as to what constituted work and what did not. So it's almost as if you can see the Pharisees gathering around the water cooler every so often, and they're like, hey, I think I've got another one. Here's this scenario that just happened, and I think here's the answer. Let's add this to the list. That was their mindset in the centuries leading up to Jesus. So now Jesus comes in, and they take great pride in the fact that they take off Saturday. They take off for the Sabbath. The Gentiles don't. Look at how holy we are. They did that with the Sabbath day. They did that with circumcision. Hey, this is what separates us. How do you know we're God's people? We take off the Sabbath. We don't work. Well, now when Jesus' disciples come through, they're hungry. The text says they're hungry. They need to eat. And they eat what's in the grain fields. The Jews were supposed to leave sections unharvested so that those who were hungry could eat. Well, the Jews now say, hey, your disciples, they're breaking Sabbath. They're harvesting on a day that they're not supposed to harvest. So now Jesus has to confront them and say, you do not understand the Sabbath. So here's what he does. He goes to two different situations in the Old Testament, really three when you include his final statement. But he proves to them you don't understand. You know about the Sabbath day. You, quote, practice it every week. You've added hundreds of stipulations about it. And you certainly love enforcing those on other people. But you still don't understand the Sabbath. And he uses two phrases to introduce these Old Testament accounts. He says, have you not read? They didn't understand because they hadn't fully read with their hearts. Here are the two scenarios he brings up. Remember David? 1 Samuel 21, he and his disciples are on the run from Saul, and they're hungry. And they get some help from a priest who gives them the bread that was in the temple. Now, Jesus is saying, technically, they ate bread that they were not supposed to eat. That was only for the priests. David is not a priest. He's asking them, why didn't you condemn David? Now, David didn't break the law because he and his men were hungry. That's a different answer than why did they not condemn David. They didn't condemn David because they were biased. They didn't look back and retroactively condemn him because, hey, he's our future king. I'm guessing that was part of Jesus' point. You didn't condemn him because you're your future king, yet you're condemning me despite me being the true king. The king who's here to establish his righteous kingdom. He also says, have you not read about every single Sabbath day your families were sacrificed for? There was an animal being killed every day. Somebody had to do the physical labor to kill them. Did you notice his language about that one? Verse number 5, how on the Sabbath the priests of the temple profane the Sabbath. He's not saying that in God's eyes they profane the Sabbath. He's saying by your standards they profane the Sabbath because they're working. They're literally having to pick up the animal. You could call that work if you wanted to. He had to slit their throats and cut them and tear them apart and build the fire and offer them. That constitutes physical activity. And yet none of you would condemn a priest. Because why? They're doing what they were commanded by God to do. And it was for a reason directly tied to God's mercy and grace upon them. They're keeping the will of God, and it happens on the Sabbath, yes. But your sins need accounted for on Saturday just as much as they need accounted for the rest of the week. And so they offer it, and you don't condemn them. So then he hits them last. Verse number 6, not only does he say something greater than the temple is here, that's me, he's saying Jesus is greater than the temple. So you hallowed that place of the temple where there's a little bit of an exception. You might call it an exception. It's not an exception. It's just in keeping with the will of God. I'm greater than the temple. I'm greater than David. I'm greater than the temple. Now, verse 7, if you had known what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. That's not a random quote. It's Hosea 6, verse 6. He's already mentioned it back in chapter 9 and verse 13. And he gave the command, go and learn what this means. Now he's hitting them hard again and said, you did not do what I told you to do earlier. You didn't go back and study Hosea to see where mercy always trumps ritual sacrifice. The care and concern for a person is always greater than outward religion that you think gives you credit in God's eyes. You always serve a person before you serve yourself. So you haven't read and you haven't truly learned on the level of the heart what God desires. So then he says, verse number 8, he is the Lord of the Sabbath. So when you track the Sabbath law, it's possible they would have said, they intellectually understood this timeline, but it's possible they would have went back to Exodus 20 and said, you know, God commanded us at Sabbath or at Sinai about the Sabbath to take it off and not work. But how thorough was God when he first gave the command there at Sinai? Listen back in Exodus 20 in verse number 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Isn't that interesting? That on verse 8 alone, he just says, you keep this day holy. The first command about Sabbath was to remember it. The second was to keep it holy. The work clause clarifies and defines the holiness. So verse 9, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. It's only then that he says, on it you shall not do any work. Verse 11, that section closes. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. There was much, much more to the Sabbath day than not working. And yet they had distilled it and boiled it down for so long that they thought, well, what does the Sabbath mean? Well, it means we don't work. Without truly engaging why God told them not to work and what they were to engage with on the day in which they did not work. And now they're at the point to where their commitment to not working far outweighed their commitment to loving one another. So Jesus' point is this: the Sabbath day predates you as a people. See, the Sabbath day started on the seventh day of creation. God rested. So Jesus is saying, the Sabbath predates you, and I predate the Sabbath. And of course, we know the truth. Not only did Jesus predate the Sabbath, he created the Sabbath. That's the greater principle here. He is the Lord of the Sabbath, not because the timeline, but because he spoke it into existence. So here's the summary of that. Since God created the Sabbath, Jesus alone is qualified to answer the question about what is lawful on the Sabbath. It's as if they thought they were God's special people because he can trust us to answer the question, what is lawful? What does work look like? Oh man, if God didn't have us, where would we be? That was their attitude. They had missed the point of the Sabbath and then distilled that missed point so far down that Jesus is saying you have hungry people that you're depriving food of. So he says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I can tell you what's lawful. And here you are disagreeing with me and going against the Scriptures. Jesus is doing what he said he came to do back in Matthew chapter 5. They would hear this discussion. They would see the story that's going to happen in the next paragraph, and they would say, Jesus is just breaking the law. Look at how profane he's treating the very law of God. And yet he's going to remind them over and over again in different ways of how he is fulfilling the law. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, do not think that I came to abolish or destroy the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, heaven and earth shall pass away, until heaven and earth shall pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. He is fulfilling the Sabbath, showing us its true meaning. Therefore, he says, verse number 20, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. You see how their righteousness can be exceeded in this text? He's saying, you view the Sabbath as this important holy day, and you view it as a way to differentiate between you and the Gentiles. You use it as a way to control the people. No matter how many Sabbaths you keep or honor, they're not living righteously. So Jesus is showing us how to, quote, in that day, for them to keep the Sabbath and to keep it with mercy and righteousness. But Matthew wants us to see this discussion continue. And so there's this kind of geographical marker. He went on from there and entered their synagogue. Matthew wants us to see, connect these stories on purpose. So verse 10, a man was there with a withered hand. He was in their synagogue, and there was a man present with a withered hand. Dried up is the idea, unusable. And they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So now it's even more ruthless for these Pharisees, because here's a man with a legitimate issue, and they call him out in front of Jesus. Some would even suggest, based on the other accounts, that perhaps they even have maybe put him up to it. They're trying to use him as bait for Jesus. Matthew tells us so that they might accuse him. And he said to them, which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. It's always good to do good. Verse 13, then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy like the other. The story's not over, though. The Pharisees went out and conspired against him how to destroy him. Now, Jesus' summary of what just happened would be something like this. He didn't need their permission to rescue someone in need. He crosses paths with a man who cannot use half of his arms. To only have use of one arm, one hand, would have significantly limited his abilities. Think if you could not use an arm, and then you were able to once again use it, how much your life would change for the better. Many of us here have had injuries to our shoulders or hands or our elbows, and you go without that, and then you begin to use it again. It's so refreshing. That time that you couldn't use it, you're amazed. How is this possible? I didn't realize how much I used this without even knowing it. Their perspective is, hey, that's great and all that you have the power to heal. We don't know how that happens. We can't do it. But if you're going to do it, you got to do it somewhere else on another day of the week. Jesus says, that's not the case. It's always lawful to do good on the Sabbath day. And he uses their own value system to prove that they're hypocrites about this. He says you have a bunch of sheep, and one of them gets stuck in the ditch. You get stuck in a pit, and it's the Sabbath day. You get a notice from your neighbor that, hey, a sheep got out and it's stuck. You would not hesitate to go to lift it up. He uses terms that are directly tied to work. Did you catch that? Take hold of it, lift it out. Even some of the same images we might think about the priest from the previous paragraph and the sacrifice. You're going to hold it, you're going to lift it up. Does that not constitute work, he says? And yet you wouldn't hesitate. Why? Because you have a dollar amount attached to that sheep. And your Sabbath restrictions suddenly can be put on pause because that sheep is that valuable to you. Well, Jesus says, of how much more value is a man than a sheep? You have it backwards. You're sitting here telling me this man is not worth healing because of the day of the week, when you would rescue a sheep. And they would likely say, well, if we don't rescue him on that day, a predator might get him, or someone might steal him from the pit. Jesus might ask back, so you're saying he's in danger? You're saying he's limited? He's saying he's vulnerable? Of course. So Jesus would then say, well, this man likewise has been vulnerable and limited for far too long. You look at some other passages where he references the Sabbath day, especially Luke 7. Sabbath is tied to bondage. It's the releasing of that Egyptian bondage. So he says, ought not this woman be freed from her ailment? Well, likewise, the meaning behind this is this man ought to be freed. And it's beautiful what's happening on the Sabbath day because that's a day of release and true rest. So you see what's happening when you combine these passages, especially in light of what he said at the end of chapter 11. Come to me, I will give you rest. Can you hear the Pharisees objecting? Why would you give us rest when we already have the Sabbath day? Look at how important it is to us and how much rest we have from God every single week. What can you give us more? And yet their restrictions and limitations were enslaving people. And so Jesus comes through and says, it's always good to do good. That mercy always precedes and is greater than sacrifice because a person is always most valuable. So maybe the biggest question for us is in this contrast of two different worlds. You got conflicting worlds. What happens in Jesus' world where everyone values mercy most of all? And compare that to a world where everyone says law keeping, law first, must be the dominant mindset. Well, just on this passage alone, in the Pharisees' ideal world, people go hungry and nobody's concerned. People are used as bait. Hypocrisy is not really that big of a deal. People are conspired against. That's really the ultimate dagger in all of this, is the Pharisees are so worried about working on the Sabbath, especially other people working on the Sabbath. Look at verse 14, though. They conspired against him, how to destroy him. What does conspiring mean? A conspiracy? People work together. It was not right for the disciples to eat some heads of grain or for Jesus to give life to this man's hand, but they were okay with getting together and talking about how they were going to kill and trap Jesus. What kind of a world happens and comes to life where that's the dominant mindset? Jesus is saying, when you follow me, you learn from me, you learn that you have true rest, not in a guarded, restricted holiday, but in me who gives life, who frees, who gives true rest at the end of every day and at the end of every week and through every moment. So as we apply these things to ourselves, we think about Galatians chapter 5, Paul's using almost the same logic throughout that entire book, applying it primarily to circumcision. Remember that other pillar that was used to separate them from the Gentiles? Even after the time of Christ, after the resurrection, you still had these holdover mindsets. And these Jewish Christians were trying to force it upon Gentile Christians. And so Paul says the fruit of the Spirit, it's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. It's exactly parallel to when Jesus says it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. It's always good to do good when Jesus is the one who's led us into doing it. And so we need to ask two important questions or recognize two important things from the characters in this text. Number one, the more, quote, religious we are, the more we need to intersect with this principle that's happening with the Pharisees. Jesus is the only one who can define and restore my Sabbaths. Now, here we're not using Sabbath as a very positive term. It could be helpful for us to get back and learn to rest in Him, especially in this culture. That's a lesson for a different time. But we need to learn to avoid the trap of the Pharisees that says that we're going to build our identity not on Jesus Christ and Him crucified and resurrected, but instead on some distillation of some other tenet of following Him. It's possible we could take something that's true and good and right and expected by God and make it the ultimate thing instead of Him who saves us being the ultimate thing. So is there a belief or a doctrine that I pride myself on, or that I pride our church upon, that can quickly elevate above Jesus if we're not careful? What spiritual habit is the greatest evidence of my own faithfulness? If I'm quick to brag about my faithfulness and I use a specific habit to do it, I'm in danger in letting that become ultimate instead of Jesus Christ remaining ultimate. What's the common thread between all the people that I'm tempted to look down upon? When I find myself judging someone for their disobedience, what's the common thread they all have? That probably reflects the opposite truth or doctrine or habit that I'm elevating too far above Jesus. Do I justify and intensify my enthusiasm about a specific doctrine or habit when it comes up? What good thing, right thing, would someone else, maybe that knows me pretty well, what would they say? Hey, you're a little too quick to be harsh about that. You get fired up too quick about this one issue. That could possibly outweigh our connection to Jesus Christ. We could be yoked to that and our identity connected to that instead of the one who gives us those commands. But don't miss the other character in the story we need to learn from. I need Jesus to restore my withered hands. Here's this man, he may have been in on it from the start, who knows? He's being taken advantage of if he is. But he has this problem, this weakness that would have limited his service. And Jesus restores his hand, therefore restoring his ability. It might be that we come before the power of God and we come before Jesus Christ and we're not fully yoked to Him because we have something that's still withered and dried up. Is there something I'm hesitant to fully give Him? I mean, you can't imagine being that guy and Jesus saying, stretch out your hand, and He's like, I don't know. I'd rather just have one hand. No, any sane mind would say, please heal me. So what is it that I have some form, outward form of, but it doesn't truly function for God? Is there something that I'm hiding underneath my sleeve? Is there a weakness that I would rather justify and debate and defend instead of recognizing it's unhealthy and truly turn it over to God? That's what Jesus means when He says, I'm gentle, I'm lowly in heart. When you come to me, you'll find rest for your souls because His yoke is easy, His burden is light. He frees us instead of restricting us unnecessarily. If He's not your Savior this morning, if you're not yoked to Him, let that change today. Come to Him, put Him on a baptism, or perhaps you are a Christian, but you've not been living as such, you've not been walking in that yoke with Him. It doesn't have to continue today. You can change. You can let Him change you. Enjoy that rest once again. If you need anything at all, we're here for you. Would you come as we sing together?